The annual Virtual Rainbow brings together LGBTQ+ youth and their families, healthcare providers, community members, and other professionals to learn about and celebrate diversity and inclusion. Thank you for joining, everyone, and welcome. Welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker and topic. The title of the presentation is Queering STEM, Envisioning Socially Just Science and Engineering Through Inclusion, Solidarity, and Ethics. And I'm so pleased to welcome Bryce Hughes as our speaker. Bryce is an assistant professor of education at Montana State University. He has long been involved in queer advocacy and scholarship in higher education, including founding the LGBT Resource Center at Gonzaga University, publishing the first paper to document LGBTQ retention in STEM, and earning, and this is a really big deal, an NSF Career Award to study LGBTQ experiences in STEM. You can read more about Bryce on the website. Bryce, thanks so much for joining us today.
You are welcome, Paul. It's absolutely my pleasure to be here. I am, being a Montana native, I grew up in Billings and then a couple years in Bozeman. To be able to see an event like this that's available to folks here in Montana and through the virtual platform beyond, it's very exciting to be able to come back to Montana and see the kinds of progress that had been made while I was off going to school, basically. As Paul's mentioned, my name is Bryce Hughes. I use he, him, and his pronouns, and I'm an assistant professor in the education department at Montana State University. Much of the research that I've become involved with since I finished my PhD has focused on LGBTQ inclusion in STEM. And so I thought it was a great opportunity to host what I hope is a bit of a conversation around this notion of queering STEM in terms of thinking about how experiences that people in minoritized communities bring to STEM help us think about a lot more broadly around the social responsibility of STEM fields to help improve society. As you well are probably aware, there are a lot of ways that STEM has been involved with domination and exploitation, yet the practice of science and engineering itself holds great benefits for improving the lives of, not just people in general, but specifically communities that have long been underserved and even exploited by the STEM practitioners in STEM fields themselves. When I switch over to the next slide about the outline, I'd love to read, at least for now, if anyone wants to post in the chat some of the reasons why they decided to come to attend this session today. Like I said, I want this to be interactive, and so I really want us to hold a conversation around envisioning these possibilities. I don't have the answer to the problem myself, but I think collectively we can work together to develop a vision for how we might use science and engineering fields to help heal society and make the world better. I used a background. I'm kind of fascinated by astronomy to a degree and looking up at the sky, and I came across this theme for PowerPoint that I thought was both visually interesting to look at, but also kind of echoes that theme of envisioning the future. The three questions that I'm hoping to explore with you in this presentation are: why is LGBTQ inclusion in STEM important? Some of that comes down to when you bring this question up with STEM audiences, a lot of people will say, well, of course we want LGBTQ people to participate in STEM, but what does their sexual identity and gender identity have to do with them being a scientist or an engineer? When I talk to queer and trans audiences about this, the answer is quite obvious. The second question then is, how does LGBTQ inclusion in STEM connect to the inclusion and participation of other minoritized communities? I sometimes, when I'm reading research around diversity in STEM, a lot of it gets framed as though everybody's trying to compete for a piece of this pie, that there's somehow only so much inclusion or participation that different groups can expect. But really what we're seeing is that it's a pattern of dominance in STEM fields that reflects a problem in STEM disciplines themselves, not so much an issue of, here's the limited amount of funding that we have to bring folks who've been historically excluded from STEM into STEM. Let's see how we can divvy that up almost in as small of pieces possible for different communities. No, it's really to raise questions of the fields themselves. And then finally, what would we envision for STEM to be socially just? You know, I mentioned at the outset, STEM has been connected to a lot of the problems that we faced, especially around how minoritized communities have been underserved in STEM fields. Yet, one of the reasons that we care about broadening participation in STEM is that these very communities could benefit from solutions that come up in science and engineering. And I'll talk a little about the ways that queer and trans communities have been underserved by STEM, but there's a host of literature out there on many different communities and how their needs were not being met, but could be met, and why broadening their participation in STEM is so important to reach those goals. I'm gonna open the chat here and just see, before I give my full introduction. So I've seen a couple comments here. One is understanding the challenges that LGBTQIA plus people face, as well as the successes of queer and trans folks in STEM, helps all practitioners better serve youth and create more inclusive programming. And then I do know that there is a heavy emphasis on STEM education and really STEAM education in the elementary and secondary education levels. And I know a lot of folks who are here with 4-H care a great deal about how, because I know agriculture has a huge connection to, well, is a STEM field within itself, not just a connection. And that there are a number of programs that are available to help youth learn the importance, not just about why they might want to consider a STEM career, but scientific thinking, quantitative reasoning. Those are skills that a lot of our youth don't have good opportunities to develop. And so there's a lot of STEM and STEAM education related programs that are oriented around how do we tap into youth motivation to be able to tie that to why it's important to learn a lot of the skills that form the basis of what it takes to be successful in STEM. And I appreciate in this comment also that learning about the ways that communities are underserved is also useful for helping youth understand how, as they develop into, say, STEM professionals, STEM educators, or folks that have some sort of connection to science, engineering, technology, or mathematics, to deconstruct the oppressive systems that, let's say, form the foundation of a lot of the work that happens in STEM. Please feel free to keep posting in the chat while I talk. But I wanted to give a little bit more, reflect a little bit more on my positionality here, because I will be talking about issues of inequity and discrimination within STEM, and that there are ways that my position in this area, I have identities that are both oppressed and privileged. So as I mentioned before, areas where I have some privilege do include what I said in my introduction. I'm an assistant professor, I have a PhD, I'm affiliated with a flagship university. all of those are areas where I carry probably a great deal of socioeconomic privilege when it comes to these discussions. I'm also white. My gender identity is identify as a man. I guess I'm trying not to say male being biological sex as opposed to man being a gender identity. And even in my background is pretty middle to upper middle class. I mean, both of my parents were college educated. One of my parents has a graduate degree. They're now retired, but and I actually went to a couple private universities. So there's a great deal of privilege within my positionality here. I also identify as gay, which is one of the few areas where I do experience some marginalization, some oppression, and it may be one of the very reasons that I am not in a STEM department right now. As Paul mentioned at the beginning, I was at Gonzaga University, but I went to Gonzaga University to get an engineering degree. And as I've gotten into work looking at equity within STEM, one of the questions that's come up for me in my own reflections is, did I decide that I didn't want to be an engineer after college because of what it felt like to be an openly, semi-openly gay student I mean, it was a Catholic university and it was a pretty conservative at the time. So I was cautious, but not completely closeted. But the experiences that I had, did that kind of signal to me, this might not be a career that I want to continue pursuing after college? That degree, though, does afford me a little bit of I don't want to say legitimacy, if that's the right word, but these are a lot of the reflections that I have when I'm engaging in this work in terms of who I'm speaking for and who I'm trying to speak with, if that makes sense. So the first question that I would like to pose, and I welcome comments in the chat. What's an important problem facing the world today that needs science or engineering to solve? You know, and it can be something like, I know folks often think about the ways that technology is helping us connect. We're looking at using the Zoom platform today. But there are also some important needs that science and engineering can help solve that may not be shared across all communities. So I'm going to mute myself for a couple minutes and wait for a couple comments to come in response to this question. Yeah, see quite a few that have come in, a couple around climate change and climate justice. I do want to recognize the fact that climate change doesn't affect all communities in the same way, and that there are some aspects of addressing climate change that are probably even more pressing because of the ways that they're affecting people right now, as opposed to when you see a lot of the long-term thinking in terms of, oh, if we keep on this path, 30 years down the road, we'll be at this particular juncture. And I see that that connects also to a couple other points around sanitation needs, increasing pollution, increasing hunger, waste management, and clean water. Thinking about Flint, Michigan recently. Also, a couple comments around healthcare. That's very relevant to queer and trans communities, as well as a lot of other minoritized communities. Critical infrastructure, waste management, and broadband connectivity. That, I think, has emerged as an important issue as a lot of schooling and work has moved online, looking at a state like Montana or other rural states where it's not quite as reliable. The ability to access the internet statewide is not as reliable as it might be in a more urban setting. As I mentioned, so the first question that I wanted to address, and again, I welcome further comments as well. Why is LGBTQ inclusion in STEM important? So some of what I'm going to share today, there's a lot of facts and figures here. There's a lot more beneath the surface, a lot of stories that also inform this research. Some of this is research that I've been involved with, and some is research that colleagues of mine have been involved with. And like I mentioned, what I'm hoping to paint is a portrait around a pattern here, as opposed to saying that, oh, we haven't gotten our share yet and it's our turn. So first of all, I published a paper about, well, I guess 3 years ago, if I can do my math correctly, that revealed that undergraduates who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and queer are about 7 percentage points less likely to stay in a STEM major from when they enter college to when they reach the end of their 4th year. And I'm working with a colleague, we're looking at data that also shows a similar pattern for students who identify as transgender, gender nonconforming, or gender non-binary. The difference there is just about 10 percentage points. That one, I've got a little asterisk there. We presented that at a conference so far. So I still consider it preliminary, even though we've looked at that data set a couple times in terms of just making sure that the soundness of our analysis. And what it basically shows is that, similar to other groups that research has long shown inequities in participation, we see this with LGBTQ students as well. And I have some of that data I'll show in just a second. But a colleague of mine who actually is a Montana State graduate, Erin Seck, she and another co-researcher did a huge national study of LGBTQ professionals in STEM, surveying people at national agencies, surveying people at through national associations, found that there are all kinds of ways that LGBTQ professionals in STEM are experiencing barriers to participation within their fields. They report that their access to fewer career opportunities, not receiving sufficient resources, not feeling comfortable being whistleblowers when issues arise, experiencing more devaluation from their colleagues or social exclusion, experiencing a poorer climate, but ultimately resulting in LGBTQ professionals as compared to cisgender and heterosexual STEM professionals, just more likely to think about and plan to leave STEM. And a similar pattern showed up in a different study that I came across that was presented at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Similar exclusion that using somewhat limited data in terms of how the authors could represent queer people, that men who identify as gay or men who are in same-sex relationships, depending on the data set the authors were using, were less likely to hold a STEM degree and less likely to work in STEM fields, there was still, given the way that gender was measured in these surveys, there was still the same difference seen between men and women that has been seen in other research. But what was interesting was they looked at what was interesting is that they looked at fields in STEM where you have higher representation of women, and those fields also tended to have higher or at least higher participation among gay men. I don't know if they found the same thing when it came to queer women. And what that basically was showing is that to some degree, there's some connection here between the types of exclusion that different minoritized communities experience and how that reflects a broader pattern of exclusion, that some fields are making some progress and some fields aren't making the same type of progress. Ooh. There we go. So why does this matter? Some of you have been sharing in the chat some points about not just, issues that science and engineering can help solve, but I'm starting to see some comments around, ooh, this doesn't feel very good to hear that LGBTQ people are facing these kinds of barriers and exclusion in STEM. And I would, what I'd like to ask is if you could post some thoughts around why this might be important. So I see one comment that talks about it not being an equitable use of creativity and resources, particularly if the reason that folks who might be interested going into STEAM fields encounter barriers simply because of who they are, as opposed to, say, trying it out, realizing it's not for them, and deciding to leave. And I would reiterate, I mean, in here, solutions for challenges and issues facing some demographics will never be found. I do want to reiterate that I do think it's important that broadening participation means that there are people at the table who know problems that may not be on the radar of folks who are in dominant groups, and thus needs that science and engineering really is positioned to meet that wouldn't be met otherwise. The answer that I gave is that STEM doesn't serve LGBTQ people well. So beyond the statistics that demonstrate the climate in STEM, we all are familiar with the ways that science has been historically used to erase queer and trans people, to invalidate queer and trans experiences. I've been working with a colleague on a paper for a biology education journal, and biology specifically has been weaponized in ways that have signaled to queer and trans people not only don't go into a STEM field, but they're telling you that not to feel proud of who you are. As I mentioned earlier, healthcare is also incredibly relevant. The healthcare system does not systematically meet LGBTQ people's needs, particularly when it comes to the type of healthcare that trans communities are trying to access. Again, the healthcare industry looking at that as either a lot of folks, I've been seeing recently some examples of healthcare providers that are using like personal beliefs as a way to avoid providing the kinds of healthcare that trans people and queer people need. And then one of the reasons is data science has either outright excluded collecting any data relevant to gender and sexual identity, or collecting poor data on gender and sexual identity. I mean, even thinking back to the statistics that I presented, there are some severe limitations with those. In a lot of those surveys, gender is not represented as expansively as people experience it. And sexual identity, I mean, the one where I was talking about gay men and same-sex couples, that was taken from census data. The census itself has been the census has not had any items that help us understand just how many people in the United States are LGBTQ, even with respect to trying to figure out how we might direct different kinds of resources to uplift communities. So how does LGBTQ inclusion in STEM connect to the inclusion of other minoritized communities? One, participation in STEM is not a zero-sum game. And there are a lot of folks who hold multiple minoritized identities who exist within STEM fields. And so the statistics I'm showing here help build what this pattern is that I'm talking about. This is data that was pulled together by the Higher Education Research Institute at UCLA, where I worked as a PhD student. And what these charts show is the difference between students who are in racial and ethnic groups that are underrepresented in STEM and students who are in racial and ethnic groups that are more represented in STEM, and how the difference in their experiences results in different outcomes. The blue and red bars that are on the chart show that for students from American Indian, Latinx, and African American backgrounds, their graduation rates in STEM fields at 4, 5, and 6 years are lower than those of white students and Asian American students. And I'll acknowledge, even though I can't do this with this data because it was done before I was there, that we've had a lot of conversations also around the ways that Asian American students' data gets aggregated also overlooks the ways that Southeast Asian students and Native Hawaiian students look different from students from other ethnic backgrounds relative to the ways that the US has controlled immigration over the last century. But this is to show that, here's another piece of evidence in this pattern. When we look at a lot of the research that's been done on gender, where gender has been measured as just one of two options, we still do see women's participation in STEM. Women's achievement of STEM degrees is lower than their achievement of degrees overall, in terms of what are the kinds of barriers that women face in going into STEM fields, as well as persisting within STEM fields under a chilly climate. And then I have some data here also on people with disabilities that show the same type of pattern, that people with disabilities are also underrepresented among STEM doctorates in STEM occupations and overrepresented among STEM workers who are unemployed. But all of these show that minoritized perspectives have historically been unwelcome in STEM. Oh, someone asked for a reference. Yeah, I actually will. I'm happy to make that available. It came from across a couple different articles that I am. I'm happy to pull that back together and make that available. Some of the statistics I pulled directly from the Federal National Center for Education Statistics website as well. One of them is the devaluing of indigenous traditional ways of knowing that's come with settler colonialism across the United States, as well as other non-Western ways of learning and knowing that may be shared among, say, immigrants or other minoritized communities here within the United States. But there are also two pieces of STEM culture that kind of get used as a way of making the argument that for some reason who we are and what we bring, what our identities are irrelevant to STEM. And it's this demand that we keep the professional and the personal separate, that somehow who we are doesn't have any bearing on what we do when, say, when we're engaged in the lab or working on a bridge. Yet these patterns that show up in the statistics would reflect otherwise. And some of that's rooted in this perception that social aspects of STEM work versus technical aspects of STEM work should also be kept separate, and that what's most important is being good at the technical aspects of STEM work without recognizing the fact that we do this work with other people. So with that in mind, what might we envision for STEM to be socially just? And as I mentioned in the little subtitle there, what if we acknowledge the politics of STEM? There are three ethics that STEM fields, these might not be the only three, but at least in the bit that I've been involved with, these stand out as three commitments that seem to be part of the root of the problem. These three different ideologies lead to the conclusions that who we are as people is irrelevant to what we do in practice. And those of us who work in fields that are outside of STEM, even if they're STEM adjacent, like I work in education, even though I do STEM education research, it's very different, the conversations we have about education. We recognize the fact that these two can't be separated. One of them is the commitment to objectivity, and it's not so much that doing science and engineering objectively is a bad aspiration, but it results in this conclusion that STEM is not and should not be political without acknowledging the fact that the types of priorities that are made, the reason that most folks who are training to go into engineering don't really work in the public sector after they're done, there are political reasons behind that, and there are political consequences to those decisions. Sometimes being more open about the inherent subjectivity and politics of what we do may actually lead to a better ethic of objectivity than pretending like it's not there in the first place. The second is the commitment to meritocracy. Oh yes, thank you. There's a comment, bodies are political. Yeah, the personal is political. Second is the commitment to meritocracy that, again, on the surface sounds like a nice ideal that, sure, everyone should be able to succeed by their individual effort. If you do the best in X, Y, or Z area, then this is the outcome that you should expect. It fails to acknowledge the fact that, oh, nice. Thank you, Paul. Paul posted a link to an article in the chat about this. It overlooks the fact that systemically, everyone who exerts the same individual effort will not have the same outcome. There are some people who are advantaged in the system, but those advantages have been covered in such a way that they don't look like advantages when people who are able to enjoy them succeed. What it looks like is I worked really hard and I was able to do this on my own. And finally, there's a deep commitment to neoliberalism and this notion around the private sector with respect to STEM. For the most part, when you talk to students who are in STEM fields, a lot of what they're looking to do is go into industry in some way. And again, I mean, getting a job is good. I mean, we need money to live and survive. But why is almost all of the work that occurs within STEM fields, why does almost all of it center around the private sector? when there are so many reasons why we know that there's a public interest in the outcomes of science and engineering as well, the achievements of science and engineering. And so that's where I want to open up another question for everyone. How could we think differently about STEM then to envision a more socially just way of doing science and engineering? I'm going to leave that one up for a few comments as well and mute myself. I see one question, funding research without corporate dollars. In my world, I don't see quite as much of that, but I know when you get into a lot of medical research, some engineering research, I feel like at MSU, at Montana State, I guess there's people here who might have affiliation with Michigan State too. At Montana State, a lot of the folks who are in engineering get federal money, like National Science Foundation. But there are some real questions. For the most part, if corporations fund research to a degree, again, the outcomes supposedly would be, if you follow the standards of the profession, you take the question, you pursue it, you collect the data, you analyze it without those interests in mind. But sometimes what we forget is to be able to access that funding in the first place, you have to be asking the kinds of questions that would align with some of those interests. And I'm sure a lot of people who are involved with some companies have some good intentions, but I think sometimes when you're in the position to exercise that kind of influence, you start to lose perception of the ways that you are, the amount of influence that you can exert on a system. Please feel free to keep posting comments. I'll share a little bit about my reflection here. One is that recognizing that scientific concerns, some of them have become, and some always were, political in nature. And I have 3 examples there. Climate change, I would say, has become political. It used to be a little bit more widely shared, and over time it's become politicized in a way that aligns with the polarization in the United States. The COVID pandemic is a great example of where political polarization has made an issue that really could be addressed through good science difficult to address. And same with infrastructure. We were talking about rural broadband earlier. Infrastructure has fallen along the lines as well. There's a comment here about acknowledging the role of colonialism and how we approach these subjects. And so that shows up in the ways that we devalue ways of knowing that are not aligned with the Western view of science. Some of it's also aligned with the ways that science itself tries to exert itself as we are here to solve your problems. We are going to insert our priorities onto your communities, and not necessarily with the sense of reciprocity that would be needed to do that well. challenging faculty to look at diversity of all forms. I know we've been through a process at Montana State. We had an advanced grant that was primarily focused on gender diversity, but the grant itself actually focused across different dimensions of diversity and really pushed folks in STEM fields around issues like implicit bias and looking at their recruitment processes to recruit new faculty, the processes by which we evaluate faculty, the ways that faculty work could be changed, all of it around the ways that bias is built into a lot of those systems. Oh yes, and people representing themselves versus people versus people who are representing others without their permission. And I see the quote, "Nothing with us about us" there. And then also the fact that busyness itself, being a part of white supremacist culture, keeps people distracted, that might be a bit of an understatement, from some of these bigger concerns, from raising some of these bigger concerns. Another one is recognizing the fact that the systems that we have that bring people into STEM fields are not equitable. As we do the work to transform these systems, we also have to acknowledge the unevenness of that field and make sure that we're committed to the success of people who are not being served by that thank you, too busy working to do the important work. To help address some of those barriers for individuals who are progressing through these unequal systems right now, these inequitable systems right now, at the same time as working on addressing the transformation that needs to happen in those systems. The fact that a lot of our social concerns will require public investment, that we can't rely just on the good nature of people who are engaged in philanthropy or corporations that want to invest in research to fully address all of the problems that we want to address. And here I have education, healthcare, scientific research as a couple examples. And then I like to look at queer theory and the way queer theory challenges us to rethink how we represent the world. That a lot of the ways that STEM is set up, it's very reductionist, it's in binary terms, and that queer theory helps us think about how do we explode some of these artificial ways that science has come to represent the world, public versus private, technical versus social, etc. That it doesn't have to be either or thinking, it can be both and thinking. That science can be both cognizant of the political nature of science and yet still commit to using methods that are, I'm trying to search for a word other than objective, because but in the sense that they represent the standards of the profession, that that people are following the procedures that lead to robust results. One more to throw out to all of you for the chat. How do you think science or engineering could be more socially just? And we've already started this in the chat, but continue it, I guess, maybe I might say. Science and cultural humility. I do frankly think that a sense of humility in STEM might be one of the most important ways to transform the culture and try to get away from some of the more Western white supremacist ways that that STEM fields are governed. It's like focusing too much on things like total grant dollars and a number of awards and things like that. Addressing subtler colonialism in STEM, definitely. And I've honestly reached the end of the slides that I have. So I would also be open if we want to turn this into a conversation instead of just posting comments in the chat.
And I believe anyone can unmute themselves.
Oh,
Go ahead and do that.
That I didn't know whether or not that was possible.
So go ahead. We've got about 15 minutes, a little under.
Yeah, I should add, if you have questions, please feel free to put questions in the chat too, or ask questions.
Bryce, I've got a question for you. Can you talk about some universities, whether they're public or private, that are really making great strides in this area, and maybe provide some examples and tell us kind of the political environment, the cultural, the student environment that kind of led to that, if there are any of those factors?
That's a good question. I mean, I know that there's a great project that's taking place at I don't even remember the name of the university now, but they've incorporated the arts into some of their engineering programs in ways that have been more LGBTQ inclusive, and that's been kind of the intention there. Was linking up, I think it was a STEM focused college, it's mostly engineering, that made some connections with theater to change how different like engineering principles can be represented, that were more inclusive. And I would kind of want to give a shout out to the like here in Montana, a lot of the work that's happening at tribal colleges and universities around restoring Indigenous ways of knowing into their science and healthcare training. I know many of the four-year universities have been partnering with tribal colleges around learning from them about not just to support American Indian students better, but also different models for doing science. Oh, thank you. Just a comment that says thanks. I appreciate it. I see a comment about keeping the future generations in mind at all times, that there will be challenges that are coming up that they may exist, they may not exist yet, but they're definitely not like, there are problems that when they are smaller, we might not see them as much until they become more acute. And then being mindful of effects and not just results and profits, that there is an impact that may not be aligned with the intention, that oftentimes doesn't get seen because it's distanced from the folks that are doing the work, or the folks that are engaged in the science or in the engineering.
I was wondering if your presentation could be available in our document share, and I'll post that those links.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to do that. I'll add a slide with references to it. I usually don't end up putting a lot of references in the slides themselves because it's a lot of text and it's hard to look at. But I can add that when I share that. Here's here's a link to Tawana Petty's work in Detroit around the ways data and surveillance are being used And that is another reminder in terms of it's not just inadvertent outcomes, but sometimes it reinforces a lot of the problematic elements of the systems that are currently there. I mean, there's a lot of STEM work that's aligned with building national defense at a time when we really aren't defending ourselves. I will advance to this slide
Questions?
so that if you want my email, you have it, but
Great, we do have time for questions, if anyone has them.
and I will add the caveat that I am not, I'm not fully the expert here in this area. There are a lot of people whose work that I look to for my own education and my own, for me to better my perspective. So I definitely don't do this in isolation, and I don't purport to know all of it. I am learning as well. Include diversity in all forms of tenure criteria. Yeah, thinking about the way that we review university faculty, and especially given that universities purport to value work done for diversity, yet it doesn't hold a central place in the ways that we evaluate the work that people are doing.
Bryce, let me, maybe if you could just share with us what your plans are for this summer and upcoming
Oh,
future research and,
hope to
just
rest a
work that
little
you're
bit
planning
this
to do.
summer, but yeah. Mostly I'll be getting started on that career grant. The questions that I'm trying to answer are around what students' social networks look like. So if we look at, say, LGBTQ students who are in STEM, who are their colleagues in STEM? Like, who are the other students that are their classmates and acquaintances? And then who do they rely on for friendship and support? And how does that compare to their peers? Because I suspect that one of the reasons is they probably know a lot fewer, they probably have much less of a community in STEM compared to what their community looks like outside of STEM. And the fact that that in and of itself is a problem. It's clearly a reflection of the barriers that students encounter going into these fields. The second is to take that retention study that I showed and actually look at degree completion instead of just whether or not they stayed in their major, but did they finish their degrees? And are there differences in, it's funny when I say, are there differences? Because I kind of expect it at this point. But the third one, which is a little down the road, would be to talk to students, to do some interviews around how does their LGBTQ identity and other personal identities interact with their becoming a scientist or an engineer. I'm really interested in if they think that it's shaping it in some way that maybe they're starting to say, I don't really know if there's a future for myself in this field. I really don't know if I'm going to stick around here, as opposed to students who might be like, oh, I'm really motivated to continue on because I know that I might be able to make some important contributions that will help other folks like me. And it's probably a good summary of what that project will look like. Those are some of my favorite data collection, is to sit down and talk to people. Oh, yes, yes. Career networks and mentors, advisors. Thank you for that.
We have just a couple of minutes left. Any last questions for Bryce?
Oh, there's a question about putting together a diversity statement. It depends on the university. So there's a question about how common it is for an applicant to submit a diversity statement, and some universities are beginning to require it as a reflection of what work have you been involved with? How does that align with the university's priorities? I don't think it's widespread. I don't remember being asked to write one for Montana State, although the honest truth is, when you look at my research statement and my teaching statement, some of that some of that would reflect what I would probably put in a diversity statement. But I want to say it's meant to help give some credit for involvement in diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts that isn't normally given credit in a faculty hiring process. But it's definitely not common. It's becoming more and more common. And yes, I actually have gone to OSTEM. I've interviewed students at OSTEM. I see a recommendation around OSTEM. I went to the national conference and ran focus groups with students in November of 2019, one of the last conferences I was able to go to. I was supposed to interview students at when Montana State hosted the, what's it called? National Conference on Undergraduate Research, and that ended up being canceled. So I did host some of those over Zoom like this. I only did a couple because that was a really rough time. It was the end of March. OSTEM is an organization. It stands for Out in STEM, or Out in Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics. It's an organization that supports or sponsors chapters at different universities for LGBTQ students who are in STEM. Montana State has one. Our John Paxton, who's the director of the School of Computing, he is the advisor to the chapter. There's also an organization called the National Organization of Gay and Lesbian Science and Technical Professionals. They've changed their name. It's not quite so complicated. I don't remember what the new name is, but that's for professionals.
We're coming up to the top of the hour here now, so we should probably conclude. This session can stay open if anyone wants to have a conversation with Bryce, but we will be starting our 1 o'clock, that's Montana or Mountain Time, sessions in just a couple of minutes. And again, you do have to log into that session. So we'll look forward to seeing you on our next session. And Bryce, thank you so much for presenting today and offering all of this great information.
Oh, you're welcome. And my email address is here if you don't want to stay now, but you want to follow up later. But I'm happy to stay on for maybe another 10 minutes or so.
Bryce, this is Kathy Cooney. Can you repeat the name of that national organization you just mentioned? I couldn't write it down fast enough.
I think they're actually now called Out to Innovate, but they were known as the National Organization of Gay and Lesbian Science and Technical Professionals. Okay. They called themselves, I'll post it in the chat, Noggle Step.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's a long name.
Well, and I think they're trying to get away from the fact that the name they were founded in around 1980, 1981, and they're trying to get away from the fact that it only says gay and lesbian in the name.
Ah, that makes sense. Yeah. Wonderful, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
All right. Appreciate all the information. Thank you so much for doing this session.
Oh, thanks. Thanks. I appreciate hearing that. You're welcome.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.
You too.